Welcome to this video in which we're going to talk about developing an aggregate plan and implementing it with using linear programming. In the last two videos, we talked about what an aggregate plan is and how you develop an aggregate unit and the basic strategies that you use when you're doing aggregate planning. Here in this video, we'll look at a specific example and use linear programming to come up with an aggregate plan, right? So, as we talked about before, when you begin an aggregate plan, there are a few things that you need, and the most important thing that you need is demand forecast. So, in this example, we'll use red tomato tools like we did in the last couple of videos. And here is the demand forecast for red tomato tools. A couple of things you will notice that the demand is highly seasonal. If you notice, demand from January through April increases steadily from 1600 all the way to 3800, almost more than doubling it. And then it suddenly goes down in May and June. And we are assuming that we are making a plan for the next 6 months from January through June, right? Based upon this demand forecast. Now, apart from this, there are other important parameters that we also need to know when developing the aggregate plan. And those parameters are, you need to know the material cost. The cost of materials for a unit is $10 per unit here. We're assuming that inventory holding cost is $2 per unit every month. The cost of stock out or backlog is about $5 per unit per month. Now, how is this calculated? Well, if it's a backlog, you're essentially assuming that if somebody comes to your store to buy a tool and you tell them that they can get the tool later, you're assuming that you're giving them a $5 discount, approximately a $5 discount to get the unit. But it is more complicated than that, but that's approximately what that is. Apart from that, if it's a stock out, you have essentially lost the sales for that person. So they might go and buy the tool somewhere, and they might come back to you potentially for buying other tools, but they might never come back to you. So you're assessing that cost of losing the one sale and future sales from that person to about $5 per unit. Now, if you hire a new worker, you're assuming that there's going to be $300 per worker to train them, just going through the hiring process and to train them. And if you're laying off a worker, you're assuming that it's going to cost you $500. And this includes severance packages and all of that, obviously. Now, every unit, to manufacture a single unit, it takes 4 hours. We are going to, the cost that you pay your workers for working regular time, not overtime, is $4 per hour. The cost that you pay them for overtime is 1.5 times that, is about $6 per hour. Now, obviously, as you see, this is an old example. $4 per hour is not even minimum wage, but this is just an example. So keep that in mind. Now, the cost of subcontracting is, we are assuming, is going to be $30 per unit. So like I said, subcontracting, when you subcontract with somebody, there are two types of contracts you can have with them. One is per unit, where they manufacture the whole unit and sell it to you, and then you buy it at a single cost, which is what we're assuming here, $30 per unit. Or the other way is subcontracting can also be per hour, where even they take 4 hours to manufacture a unit, and then you pay them by the hour rather than by unit. But either way, it comes out to be the same, approximately $30 per hour. So with all of this information, with the demand information and all this information about the manufacture of this item, let's see how you develop aggregate plan, right? So we're going to do it as a linear program. Obviously, that's what this video is about. So for the 6 months that we have, so January through June, we're going to number them 1 through 6 with the subscript T. So W subscript T, so W1 will be the workforce size for month 1, W2 will be the workforce size for month 2, and so on. So this variable WT tracks how many people you have hired every month, right? So if I remember correctly, I think we begin with the workforce size of 80, right? So we begin with 80 people. So that's another parameter that is not mentioned here, but it was in the textbook. So we begin with 80 people. So we track the workforce size per month. So how many people did you have at the beginning of the first month, the second month, third month, fourth month, all the way up to the 6th month. Then HT are the number of people you hire at the beginning of a month, and LT are the number of people you lay off at the beginning of a month. Usually you won't do both. It's very rare. I mean, it doesn't make sense for you to lay off somebody and then hire somebody else, because first of all, laying off is more expensive than hiring somebody, and if you hire somebody, you have to train them and everything. So it's not easy, right? Now, PT is the number of units you produce in a month. Remember that the whole idea is for us to come up with a plan to satisfy this demand. So this is the demand, and we have to satisfy this demand. So in January, we have a demand for 1,600 tools, February 3,000 tools, and so on. So you have to make so many tools every month. So PT represents the production in the month. IT is the inventory at the end of the month. So after satisfying your demand and everything, how many units are you left over by the end of the month? ST is the number of units stocked out at the end of the month, and so number of units that are either backlog or stock out. So in this case, we're going with stock out, but if you're doing backlogs, it's very similar. So CT will be the number of units that you subcontract for a month. So you might not have enough manufacturing capacity yourself or service capacity yourself, so you subcontract it. This happens a lot, especially with, say, call centers. When you have call centers, you might have a certain number of people, but if you have a contract that requires more than that people, you might subcontract with a different call center. So it could be in the service setting also, right? And then OT will be the number of overtime hours worked per month. Now this is the one that's going to be that we will track carefully, because we will have a certain number of workers. Say, for example, if we have 100 workers, each worker will work 40 hours a week, right? So if they work 40 hours a week, we'll assume 4 weeks in a month. So they will work 160 hours in a month. That's how many hours a single worker is going to work, right? But overtime, we are not calculating overtime per worker. We're going to calculate the total number of overtime hours that we need for the whole month, and then we will leave it up to the managers to decide how to divvy it up amongst the number of workers that we have. So all we are tracking are the total number of overtime hours that you need in a month, and that is OT. So you'll have O1, O2, O3, O4, all the way up to O6. So you can subcontract some units, you can have some extra overtime, and still subcontract some units, right? So those are all our decision variables. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8 types of decision variables, and each of these will have 6 of these. So we'll have 48 decision variables in total. Now, with that, let's look at the objective function. So the objective function for Red Tomato Tools is to minimize the total cost of this aggregate plan. So the total cost includes regular time labor cost, overtime labor cost, cost of hiring and layoffs, cost of holding inventory, cost of stocking out, because we are considering stocking out, cost of subcontracting, and of course the cost of manufacture itself, the cost of materials, right? So this is the total cost that we are trying to minimize, right? And we can write it this way, because we know the parameter values from here. We can write the objective function this way. So WT is the number of workers that you have in a month. Each worker is going to work for 160 hours in a month, and each worker is paid $4 an hour. So 160 times 4 is 640. So that is where this number comes from. So essentially, you're paying your workers $640 a month. Again, remember, $4 an hour is not even minimum wage. This is just an example from a long time ago. So it's just a number that's used to come up with a problem. So it's obviously a watered down version of a real life problem, and you would have to pay your workers at least minimum wage. And especially if it's specialty manufacturing, you're paying them more than that. You're probably paying them $10, maybe $15, $20 an hour, depending upon what kind of work they are doing. So here we are assuming $4 per hour. With 160 hours in a month, you pay your workers $640 a month. So it's $640 times the number of workers that you have each month, plus it's $6 per overtime hour. So these are the total number of overtime hours you have. You multiply that with 6. So this is the cost of the overtime. So it's cost of regular time, cost of overtime, right? Then the total number of workers that you hire times 300, because it costs you $300 to hire workers, $500 to lay off workers. So 500 times the total number of workers who are laid off over the 6-month period. And then inventory cost, the total amount of inventory that you hold times $2. That's the cost of holding inventory. And the cost of stock out. So if you're stocked out, it's going to cost you $5 per stock out unit, per unit that you're stocked out. And then of course the production cost. So the material cost is $10 per unit. So $10 times PT. Obviously in this case, we are only looking at material cost as production cost, but there can be other costs for production costs also. And in this case, it's just the material cost. If we look at a different example later on where we have other costs other than material cost. And finally, the cost of subcontracting. $30 per unit to subcontract. So these are the total number of units that you subcontract, and that gets added up. So that's your total cost of subcontracting. So this is your total cost, all your costs put together. And you want to minimize this total cost and manufacture the number of units that you have to manufacture. But based upon the problem itself, there are some constraints that we have to consider. Now, there are there's one or two constraints that I didn't talk about, but other constraints are natural constraints. So let's look at the 4 big constraints that you usually have. One is the workforce balance constraint, which is how many workers do you have in a month? This will be equal to the number of workers you had in the previous month plus the number of workers you hired minus the number of workers you laid off. Now, usually you will not have both of these numbers. So if you hired workers, you'll likely not laid anybody off, but if you laid somebody off, you're not going to hire anybody. But either way, so this is a constraint that balances the number of people you have based upon the number of people you had last month and how many people you are going to hire and fire at the beginning of this month. So you have workforce balance constraints. Second, you have capacity constraints. So capacity constraints are, we have WT employees. Those are the number of people working for you this month. So 40 times WT is the total number of units that you can make. Why is it 40 times WT? Because remember that if you go back to this list of parameters, remember that each person is working for 160 hours in a month, right? And it takes 4 hours of labor to make a single unit. So each person can make 160 divided by 4 or 40 units in a month. So if they work their total, if they work their full shift of 160 hours, they should, each person individually should manufacture 40 units by themselves. So 40 units times the number of workers that you have. So this gives you the number of units that you can manufacture in regular time. So 40 units times the number of workers plus the number of units that you can manufacture in overtime. Now, this is not based upon the number of workers you have. You just have, you're saying that, okay, this month I need 200 hours of overtime. Now, how do you allocate those 200 hours? That's really up to you. You can divide it amongst all your workers equally, or maybe somebody gets more, somebody gets less. Some people might want to work overtime and some people might not. And then that becomes a different problem in itself. All we are tracking here is how many hours of overtime do you need. And if you have, say, 20 hours of overtime, each unit requires 4 hours of manufacture. So 20 divided by 4 will be 5. So essentially you can make 5 units in overtime. So the total amount that you can produce cannot exceed the capacity that you have. This is the capacity in regular time, and this is the capacity in overtime, right? 40 units per person for the whole month. Why is it 40? Because one worker can work 160 hours and it takes 4 hours to make a single unit. So 160 divided by 4 is 40. So each worker in a month can make 40 units by themselves, 40 tools by themselves. And OT is the total number of overtime hours. OT divided by 4 tells you the total number of tools that can be made in overtime. So number of tools made in regular time, number of tools made in overtime, and that's the maximum that you can make. You cannot produce any more than that. So that's the capacity constraint. Then you have the inventory balance constraint. And again, this might look complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. You're saying that if you add the inventory from last month, so you have some leftover from last month, you add the number of units that you produce this month, number of units that you subcontract this month. So that is the total number of units that you have on hand. This is how many were left over from last month. This is how many you made this month. And this is how many you got from outside, so produced from outside. So total number of units that you have on hand. What do you do with this? With this, you satisfy demand. So some of these units get sold off because that's the demand. Plus, any backlog that you had in the previous month also needs to be satisfied. So demand from this month plus the backlog from the previous month. So this is the total demand that you need to satisfy. And anything that is left over is considered inventory. Now, if anything is left over, that is considered inventory. But if nothing is left over, in fact, we are stocked out this month also, then whatever is left over is a stock out. So when you say IT minus ST, you will only have one or the other. You either stocked out this month and you'll have negative inventory, in which case you'll have ST, or you are not stocked out this month, you have excess inventory left over, in which case you will have IT, right? So this is the inventory balance constraint. So this is how many units you have. You satisfy demand with it, satisfy any backlog from last month with it. And if you have any units left over, it is inventory. Otherwise, you have a backlog this month, right? So that's the inventory balance constraint. And finally, overtime limit constraint. Now, this was not again clearly stated in the slides, but in the textbook, you know that you're said that it is given that each worker cannot work more than 10 hours of overtime. So the maximum amount of overtime that you can work is 10 times the number of workers. So OT is less than or equal to 10 times WT. So that's the overtime limit. So these are your 4 constraints. So we looked at the decision variables, we looked at the objective function, and we've looked at the constraints, right? So now we are going to put this into a solver and solve it. I will post that in a different video, but the solution will look something like this. So the solution will tell you, say, how many people. So if you, the optimal solution, you'll notice that we have a period 0 saying that this is where we are starting right now. So let's say December. And so at the beginning of January, you're going to lay off 16 workers. You'll end up with 64 workers, and that is how many people you're going to have for the 6-month period. You're not using any overtime. You'll notice that inventory varies significantly. Some months you have high inventory because demand is low. In some months you have no inventory because demand is very high. Now for that 1 month when demand is really high, you actually have a stock out. You are not able to satisfy all demand. You'll only be able to satisfy everything except for 220 units, even when you subcontract it out. You subcontract out 140 units, even then you cannot satisfy all the demand that you have, right? So that's the final plan. You'll notice that the cost will come out to 422,660. Now, so this week we'll just look at the basic aggregate plan. So there are other things that you can do. What happens if demand variability is much higher? What happens? So once you create this plan, how do you make it so that now you go from the aggregate plan to each individual tool family? So you had families A, B, C, D, E, F. How do you go to family A, B, C, D, and E, F? How do you do that? We'll look at all of that in next week. This week, the idea is to introduce you to the basics of aggregate planning and look at one example of an aggregate plan. I will do another example of an aggregate plan during our synchronous session, but this is it. So I'm going to end the video here. In the next video, we'll look at the linear programming formulation in Excel. All right? Take care.